I challenged myself to pick just one inaccuracy from Gladiator 2 to fix. There were a lot to choose from, but I wanted to find the one change that would have the biggest impact and address the biggest issues. I know that sounds hostile, like I'm just here to pick apart this movie, but I promise that's not the case. Ridley Scott, he set out to tell a story, not a history lesson, and sometimes accuracy does not make for a more engaging theatrical experience. Gladiator actually addresses this in one of my favorite little tongue-in-cheek bits. It comes right after Maximus wins a fight he was supposed to lose. He was playing a barbarian in the Battle of Carthage, and Commodus says,
"My history's a little hazy, Cassius. But shouldn't the barbarians lose the Battle of Carthage?"
Yes, sire. Forgive me, sire.
No, I rather enjoy surprises.
And I like surprises too. Sharks in Analmakia, A+, that was a great surprise. I am entertained. This is why I'm here. More historical drama should have unlikely sharks. Everything is improved by adding apex predators. I've always said this. Now, that shark fight is introduced as the Battle of Salamis between the Persians and the Trojans, when it was actually the Persians and the Greeks. Is that a pointless error that would be so easy to fix? Yes, but is it a big change? No, I want to try and focus on the big picture things. And some of the small changes, I think they added something. They made the movie more engaging, like making the Severan brothers, Geta and Caracalla, into twins. Caracalla was actually older than Geta, but making them twins invites a parallel with Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, the ones raised by a wolf, as Lucius explains.
And what's that up there? A wolf?
The twins there, they were outcasts, left in the hills to die. That wolf found them and she suckled them on her milk. Raised by an animal, it's in their blood.
How do you know this?
Making Geta and Caracalla into twins suggests that they have that same inevitable savagery of Romulus and Remus, of someone raised by a wolf. And Lucius doesn't cover this, but Romulus and Remus famously turn on each other. So the parallel becomes this Easter egg that foreshadows how Caracalla is going to turn against Geta. Again, it's this small adjustment that I think really adds something. I also wasn't complaining about the fact that Lucilla was there, even though she was supposed to have died back in 182 for engineering a plot against her brother, but I'll come back to that later. And all these small changes pale in comparison to the bigger changes, like the quest to restore the Republic. With that, I do think that the real-life tension within the government around the turn of the 3rd century is more engaging, and I was tempted to try and change this aspect of the movie, but I ultimately decided against it, and I'll explain why. So, the real Marcus Aurelius ruled at the end of about a century of notable stability within the empire, that just so happened to coincide with about a century of emperors choosing adults to adopt as their heirs, rather than passing on the empire to a biological child. I don't want to overhype the peaceful nature of this period. You still had internal strife, suspected plots, executions, but there were no civil wars, and you had people who ruled for long periods of time, relatively peaceful transitions of power, and you had some very good relationships between the emperor and the Senate. The biggest sign of this internal harmony came under the rule of Marcus Aurelius, and this was his co-rule with Lucius Verus. Not that Lucius Verus, this was his father, well, his supposed father, who was dead by the time that Gladiator starts. That co-rule with Marcus Aurelius was a big deal. Rome had never done that before. In fact, it hadn't had two centralized rulers like that since the Republic, when you had two consuls who worked together as a kind of executive branch in concert with the Senate. So having these two emperors was not only a sign of incredible harmony in the government, it was something that specifically might have recalled the Republic. And things worked great until 169, when Lucius Verus dies on the way home from campaign. And Marcus Aurelius ultimately replaces him with Commodus, making him both his co-ruler and his heir. Commodus was despised as a decadent tyrant and ultimately assassinated in 192. Afterwards, the Praetorian Guard nominated a man named Pertinax to be emperor. Cassius Dio, who was both a historian of this period and a senator during this time, says that we senators loved Pertinax. We were happy to confirm him. He had been a senator. We thought this was great. Like other despised emperors, Commodus was condemned with damnatio memoriae, the destruction of his image and legacy. According to Dio, Pertinax tried to restore order from some of the chaos that Commodus had wrought, but ultimately his attempted reforms to the Praetorian Guard put him on their bad side. And this is where things get really off the rails, because the Praetorian Guard not only assassinated Pertinax, they then decided to auction off the throne to the highest bidder, which wound up being a guy named Didius Julianus. He was not a popular emperor. The Senate hated him, the people were protesting in the streets, and when they heard about his rise, not one, not two, but 3 different generals rebelled and tried to take power for themselves. This was Pescennius Niger, Clodius Albinus, and Septimius Severus. Severus winds up being the one who takes power from Didius Julianus and then wages civil war against the other 2. He's ultimately successful, he takes over the throne, and his heirs are Dhna and Caracalla. I'll get to those 2 in a second, but this is a juicy bit of history, right? There's all this tension about who really has power in Rome. Is it the emperor? Is it the Senate? Is it the Praetorian Guard? Is it the generals with their armies waiting to invade? How do the people express their will in any of this? That to me is a lot of drama. But I can see how it would be hard to translate onto the screen. Republic good is a much simpler message than, well, we probably need an emperor because we've had an emperor for the past 200 years or so, but he should have a good relationship with the Senate. He should try and adopt someone who is qualified to rule. We need to protect these forces from these kind of paramilitary or military forces. That the movies are already 2.5 hours long each, and that would make them so much longer. And Gladiator still tackles some of these same issues, starting with this idea of choosing a worthy successor. Marcus Aurelius picks Maximus as his heir rather than his biological child. And the movie ends with a hope that power will go to the Senate, which sort of matches Pertinax's good relationship with them and his attempted reforms to the government. The movie skips over the Civil War, but you can see its effects, even though the movie sells them short. Septimius Severus took power violently, and like anyone who comes to power by force, his first order of business was to legitimize his rule. He did this in stages. Before the other 2 generals were defeated, he seems to have styled himself as a second Pertinax, someone who's really just there to kind of fix everything that's gone wrong, someone who's going to have a good relationship with the Senate, definitely someone who's going to pick a good successor rather than just pass the empire on to his children. But then, once he had solidified his power, he had himself retroactively adopted into the family of Marcus Aurelius, and like Marcus Aurelius, he made his son, Caracalla, co-ruler, even though Caracalla was only 11 at the time. And Marcus Aurelius' decision to make Commodus his co-ruler and heir was widely regarded as a bad one. Severus now insisted that no, actually, it's a great idea to establish your biological child as your co-ruler and heir. And not only that, but it was a good idea when Marcus Aurelius did it too. Commodus was a good ruler. Severus not only had Commodus's Damnatio Memoriae walked back, he really tried to kind of rewrite how people understood this choice, because he was essentially trying to do the same thing. It was a good idea when Marcus Aurelius did it, and it's a good idea when Severus is doing it now. Dhna and Caracalla both inherit the throne, with a final warning from their father to try and keep the peace between them, which instantly fell apart. These 2 hated each other, and Caracalla had his brother assassinated very soon after they took control. Not only that, but he condemns his brother to damnatio memoriae, which you can see on this portrait of the Severan family. He destroyed not just his brother's life, but his legacy. Keep that portrait in mind, by the way, we'll come back to it. Both movies have that tension around legacy. Starting with, again, with Marcus Aurelius himself. His decision to return Rome to a republic is not just about his son being unfit to rule, but how Marcus Aurelius himself will be remembered. Will I be remembered as a tyrant, he asks.
Or will I be the emperor who gave Rome back her true self?
And Maximus honors that. When he insists that the Republic be reinstated at the end of the first movie, he stresses that these are the wishes of Marcus Aurelius. And then Maximus himself, in the second movie, the greatest insult to him is not just the destruction of his life, but the destruction of his legacy. We see his damnatio memoriae in the erasure of his name from the list of gladiators, remembering him as a kind of rebellion, and then he even seems to wind up representing the idea of legacy itself, that what we do in life echoes in eternity. Central to the movie is this idea that it's on the people who come afterwards to preserve it. Maximus hadn't been forgotten, but his legacy had been destroyed, and so it's on Lucius Verus to revive it. That's a great theme for a sequel, and for a movie that's about this period when memory was so fraught and politicized, and just in general, as a historian, I'm here for a message that remembering people is important, that their legacy matters. The worst thing you can do to someone is erase them from history. Which brings us so close to this change that I want to make. We're almost there. Because the second movie especially is not good with real people's legacies. I already talked about how we see some of that in the first movie. Marcus Aurelius did not usher in the end of the Republic. Lucilla did not survive her brother's rule. But the second movie really amps it up, starting with Macrinus. Now, don't get me wrong, he was easily my favorite character. Denzel Washington was so good. And that's not a hot take at all. He's amazing, but he was amazing. Anytime he was on screen, it felt like anything could happen. There was this tension, this real sense of unpredictability. Any scene with him intimidating the senators, those were so good. He's another apex predator, and we know how I feel about those. His backstory is also the most interesting thing that the movie did. That moment when they reveal that he had been enslaved and by whom, that was so good, because it complicates this idea of legacy. Macrinus reveals that he was enslaved not by someone like Commodus or the Wonder Twins, Romans we already hate, but by Marcus Aurelius, the patron saint of freedom. That's his legacy to Macrinus. And Macrinus' entire life work is also about legacy.
The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury.
He wants to undo this man's legacy or counteract it or erase it, and with good reason. In both movies, the worst thing that happens to our heroes is that they are enslaved. Macrinus is driven by the exact same anger that both Maximus and Lucius Verus are driven by. So why is it different when it's him? That's a gutsy question to introduce to what is overall a pretty simple movie. So it disappointed me that they didn't seem to really want to grapple with it. They just reveal that what he really wants is ultimate power and then kill him off. It's also a frustratingly standard treatment of a character like Macrinus. FD Signifier has already put out a video that talks about how Macrinus fits into this kind of trope of a black villain who questions the establishment. And his criticisms tend to be fundamentally reasonable, or at least worth consideration, but instead of addressing them or really, grappling with them at all, the narrative will just twist this character into a monster and then dismiss him. I'll link the video below in case you haven't had a chance to watch it, but I just want to say that I really agree with that point, that what they did with Macrinus and the ideological challenge that he represents is cheap at best. As a moviegoer, I was frustrated, and as a historian, I was way more frustrated. And this part, Sarah Bond has already talked about in her review of the movie, so I'll link that below. But what she points out is how Macrinus is part of a much larger misrepresentation of North Africa and Roman Africa as a whole. Numidia and other such provinces, like Africa Proconsularis, are characterized as rebellious and non-Roman from the opening scenes of the movie, even though they had by then been part of the Roman Empire for many centuries, and a great number of wealthy Roman families were living within them. The most allegedly progressive casting for the movie was Denzel Washington as the African usurper Macrinus, a gladiator troop owner and power broker. The real Macrinus was a Mauritanian and a Praetorian prefect from a wealthy family of elite Roman equestrians, originally based in what is now Algeria. Instead of depicting Macrinus as the wealthy African from an established Roman family that he is, Scott chooses to depict Macrinus as an upstart, and, as it is revealed later, a formerly enslaved person. So the issue is not just that Macrinus is this stereotype of a black villain, but that the movie chose to do that rather than what history would have actually given them, which is this Roman from the upper echelons of society. It's in the context of them functionally rewriting history to avoid showing Roman Africa as powerful or even part of the Roman Empire. Roman Africa figures pretty prominently within the movie, but it's always outside of the scope of the empire. Numidia is shown to be rebelling against Roman rule. It's actually the last holdout against it. Lucius Verus runs there when he wants to escape Rome. He pretends to be Numidian to avoid revealing that he is a Roman. And then our villain is Macrinus, someone with African heritage who is rewritten to be an outsider rather than someone coming from, again, the upper echelons of Roman society. And the most bizarre way that they misrepresent Roman Africa in power in Rome is how they handle the emperors themselves. Septimius Severus was from North Africa, is from Leptis Magna, specifically in what's now modern-day Libya. You can see from this portrait that he does not look like he could be the father of either emperor in the movie. Here's another portrait of his, which was recently reconstructed. Casting these two actors as his sons, however talented they may be, that's not the issue here. Giving them strawberry blonde hair, that's a choice that the movie made. And it feeds into this misconception in the movie generally about what the Roman Empire looked like and what power in Rome could look like. But as bad as it is, there's one thing that I think went even further, because that's not just about misrepresentation, it's about erasure full stop. This is about someone who's not even there. Someone who was one of the most powerful people in Rome at this time, in the exact period when the movie was taking place. And there's not one mention of her, not one word. If I could change just one thing about Gladiator 2, it would be to add Julia Domna. Now, if you don't know who that is, I don't blame you. So again, movie says nothing about her. And I'm going to explain why that was such a pointed choice. Julia Domna came from an old royal family in Misa, a city in Syria. She married Septimius Severus when she was about 17, rose to power with him as he took over the empire, and was the mother of Dhna and Caracalla. As empress, she took on the unusual title of Mater Castrorum, the mother of the military camps. It's already an interesting title for a woman to have. Not unprecedented, but definitely unusual. But where things get really interesting, and most relevant to the movie, is when her husband dies. Dhna and Caracalla inherit the throne, and supposedly their father's final words were to urge them to get along. And these two famously did not get along at all. The government's best hope of peace between them, and thus peace in the empire, avoiding a civil war, came down to Julia Domna. Julie Langford, in her book on Julia Domna, talks about how at this point the Senate gave Domna two titles that had never been given to a woman before. Pia Felix, which called her pious and fortunate, and the all-encompassing Mater Senatus Mater Patriae, the mother of the Senate and the mother of the fatherland. And Langford talks about how this was essentially the Senate reminding Domna of her obligations and also pleading with her to make sure that peace in the empire was preserved. So she would have been central to the exact time period that the movie is covering. Now, the ancient historians really vary in how they portray Julia Domna. Sometimes she's the scheming, crafty Syrian princess, and the Historia Augusta even goes so far as to spin this really over-the-top tale about how she seduces her son for more power. But she's also presented as the beleaguered Roman mother who is trying desperately to stop her sons from destroying each other and the entire empire. The historian Herodian says that at one point, these two brothers were talking over the idea of just splitting the empire in two. Each of them could take their separate halves. And Julia Domna supposedly said, "Over my dead body. Kill me first, and each of you take your half and bury it so that I can be divided like the land and sea." And that worked. The idea was abandoned. But the discord between the brothers continued, and Dio says that Caracalla actually used his mother in order to kill Dhna. He goes to her and says that he actually wants to reconcile with Dhna, and so his mother should invite them both to come speak to her without their guards. Dhna shows up, full of trust, and Caracalla instantly has one of his centurions strike him down. And then Dhna, in his final moments, goes to his mother, pleading with her to help, and then dies in her arms. And the worst part of all of this, according to Dio, is that she couldn't even mourn her son because her other son was watching her so closely for any sign of disloyalty. And then, once Caracalla is the sole ruler, Julia Domna is described as doing a lot of the actual work of being emperor. She's handling all of Caracalla's imperial correspondence, she's receiving petitions, she's meeting with important people in his name, she's giving him all this good advice, which he is ignoring because he's busy on his pointless campaign. Think about how she would translate to this movie. There's so many directions that you could go with her. Is she trying to preserve her husband's legacy? Does she want power for herself? What's her relationship like with Lucilla and her faction, or with her sons, or with Rome? And the biggest impact might be to actually give Macrinus someone to really spar with. He steamrolls everybody in every scene until the end. There's no match for him. And just imagine if there was another apex predator in the room, the wolf who nursed this current Romulus and Remus. That would be not just better history, but a better story, right? And Julia Domna would have had thoughts about Macrinus. Supposedly, her power was so entrenched that by the time he took over, she actually considered a coup to try and take power for herself. Now, in real life, she realized that wasn't feasible, but in a movie, you could let her try, let her have at it. And then when she realized it wasn't possible, she decided to starve herself to death. And if that doesn't translate well to the big screen, you could give her a different but equally intense end. Let Macrinus kill her himself, which would then set up the real-life revenge that her sister takes. This is Julia Misa, who, according to Herodian, is behind the revolt that ultimately gets Macrinus off the throne and replaces him with her grandson, Elagabalus. He was only 14 at the time, and so Julia Misa and Elagabalus' mother, Julia Sohaemias, figured prominently in his rule. This period is actually known for the centrality of the women from this one Syrian family. Meanwhile, as far as I can remember, the movie only has 3 named women characters. There's Arishat, Lucilla, and her slave Laita, who doesn't have any lines. That's pathetic. That's pathetic for any movie, but especially a movie about power in Rome at this time. Lucilla is the only woman character who represents that, and as the imperial mother character, it almost feels like she's there at the expense of Julia Domna. Like the creators thought that if there were these 2 moms on screen at the same time, maybe even talking to each other. I don't know, the set would explode or something. I don't know what they thought. But whatever the reason, they chose to represent Connie Nielsen's character instead of the Syrian mother of the emperors. And again, this is not about being a stickler for accuracy. I get that they're trying to tell a story, not give a history lesson. But the issue is what kind of story they want to tell. Why they want to tell a story that doesn't just misrepresent people like Macrinus, but completely erases people like Julia Domna. They obliterate her from the record, and they do it in a movie whose central thesis is that the worst thing that you can do to someone is destroy their legacy.